Hello, and welcome to the Number 5 Planning Podcast. Now, as some of you will hopefully know, annually, Number 5 Chambers hosts an annual planning seminar in Birmingham, in which members of Chambers come together with people from across the sector to discuss and provide updates on some of the key issues that have gone on over the last 12 months. This year's seminar was held at the end of March, and in today's podcast, I'm going to be delving into one of the papers that was presented in a bit more detail for our podcast audience. The paper in question concerns key housing appeal decisions that have been handed down in recent months. So we're going to be looking at a few themes in housing appeal decisions over the last few months. We're going to be looking at it through the lens of 4 of the more interesting appeal decisions. And I'm joined for that purpose by Chatura Saravanan, who is a pupil at the Planning Environmental team at Number 5 Chambers, and she's going to help by giving us an overview of some of those cases. We're going to start by looking at the impact of character and appearance and heritage, and by asking whether and how far, as a local authority, a character and appearance and heritage case can get you, or when your housing supply is in, as it was in this case, the low ones, if not a bit lower. And the appeal decision that we're talking about first is land at 1-5 Hillside Road, Portsmouth Road in Surrey. And I started by asking Chatura just to explain what the appeal was about and what the key issues were.
So the appeal was for a proposal for 38 C3 retirement homes split across 2 blocks located in Elmbridge District Council. The main issues related to character and appearance, heritage, impact on neighbours and Greenbelt and PDL. And for context, the inspector concluded that the council had at best a 1.04-year housing land supply and at worst a 0.78-year housing land supply. So it was a particularly poor housing land supply position for the council to be in. The inspector's conclusions on the matter were several, but I want to focus on 3, and these are to do with character and appearance, heritage, and the golden rules. On character and appearance, the inspector was particularly concerned with the second block, Hillside 2, which she noted would just be a spatially and visually large and bulky building, and therefore it would substantially harm the openness of the Greenbelt, and therefore she found that the proposal did not fall within the PDL exception to the Greenbelt. She then went on to consider heritage, and this was a particularly interesting matter because heritage was in fact not an issue between the council and the appellant, but the inspector raised it as a key issue at the CMC and went on to consider it in depth as part of the decision. This was primarily because the site was located within the setting of the Esher Conservation Area, which the inspector found was of special architectural and historic interest. She concluded that the proposal would in fact sever the last link between the conservation area and its setting, thereby conflicting with Purpose D of the Greenbelt, which is to preserve the setting and special character of historic towns. Curiously, both the council and the appellant attempted to argue that York or Chester were, and I quote, more worthy candidates for the term historic towns as mentioned under Purpose D. However, the inspector did not accept this submission and concluded that York and Chester were historic cities and that Esher is a historic town. This makes us wonder what the policy hook for this distinction is, particularly in light of the new PPG released, which differentiates between historic towns and villages, but not cities. Ultimately, she gave moderate weight to housing and the concomitant benefits against the heritage harm, and this was partly because the site already had extant permission for 18 dwellings, which is again a reminder that extant permissions on sites can be a relevant consideration when a new planning application is being assessed. Therefore, in conclusion, the heritage harm was found not to have been outweighed by the public benefits, and in addition to this, the proposal was found to be a major development, and yet it failed to meet the golden rules. The failure to meet the golden rules was found to weigh against the proposal. However, notwithstanding non-compliance with the golden rules, the inspector concluded that other harms nevertheless outweighed the benefits. This is a reminder that golden rules are not applicable only where a grey belt argument is being run. If you're a major development and in the green belt, compliance with golden rules can and is likely to be considered, notwithstanding whether you're arguing for a grey belt exceptions, and non-compliance with the golden rules could weigh against a proposal in the planning balance.
Thank you. So a slightly unusual appeal on the facts, pretty rare in this policy day and age to find a housing land supply of 0.78 years still resulting in a consent. and heritage harm identified, despite the fact that neither the council nor the appellant were pointing to heritage harm in any particularly significant degree. So what are the key takeaways from this appeal?
Well, firstly, we see that character and appearance can still beat a poor housing land supply position. In this case, as you noted, it was particularly poor. However, of course, it is important to note that harm to character and appearance was not the sole issue with this proposal. Heritage and impact on neighbours were also key issues. Secondly, the inspector highlighted the distinction between historic cities and towns, and we will, I assume, in due course see how and whether such a distinction may be applied or argued for in future appeals. And finally, beware of the compliance with golden rules and try to comply with it as long as you are a major development in the Greenbelt, notwithstanding whether you are arguing for a grey belt exception or not.
Thinking then about grey belt, we're obviously going to get an increasingly large body of grey belt appeals that come along in the next few months. But a couple of appeals that you've picked out, or one in particular appeal that you've picked out that's interesting over the last months, deals specifically with the interaction between grey belt and very special circumstances more generally. And that's an appeal in Ashfield, land between 124 and 142 Church Lane, Selston. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, so this was a proposal for a fairly small development, up to 8 dwellings, and the main issues were to do with the definition of limited infilling, green belt, grey belt, golden rules, and ecological impacts. And again, for context, Ashfield District Council was found to have less than 3 years of housing land supply as of April 2023. The inspector concluded that the proposal did not fall within the meaning of the term limited infilling, because although the proposal could be seen as infilling, the site itself represented a wide distinguishing gap, and it formed part of an extensive tract of open land that separated 2 parts of Selston. Therefore, it was not infilling of a limited nature. The site was found to be grey belt, but the proposal itself did not meet the golden rules, and ultimately the proposal was found to cause significant harm to the openness of the green belt, and given all of the above, permission was refused as very special circumstances were not met.
So what can we take away from this decision, and how does it interact more generally with the type of sort of cases that we've been seeing where very special circumstances and grey belt are being considered in the same decision letter as part of the same site?
Right, so firstly, it's important to remember to satisfy that the limited infilling exception for green belt, the proposal has to be truly limited, and what this means will vary from site to site and proposal to proposal. Secondly, it's a reminder that major development is not only those proposing 10 plus homes, but also those where the site is 0.5 hectares or more, as was the case here. Now, something that I noticed generally in the research is that we are yet to come across a major housing appeal decision where a grey belt argument has been run unsuccessfully, but the VSC test was nevertheless met. And we must accept that there is some overlap between what can constitute VSC and compliance with golden rules. However, this is not to say that just because a development is found not to be grey belt, that it will not meet the VSC test. For example, in this appeal, the inspector found that the site was grey belt, but the proposal did not meet golden rules, so it could not utilise the benefit of being grey belt. However, we can equally envisage a scenario where the site may not be grey belt, but the proposal meets the golden rules, where it could then go on to pass the VSC test. Therefore, it is worth running a VSC argument alongside a grey belt argument, as at least in principle, one can succeed where the other fails. There has also been a key appeal decision on a housing development for a proposal in Solihull, where VSC was met, where a grey belt argument was not run at all, which is further proof that VSC is still very much a relevant and important point at appeals.
Thank you very much. That's really helpful. Moving on to a separate topic then, and not dealing with the substantives in this instance. Costs. As listeners will know, costs are often something of a secondary consideration in appeals because, for very obvious reasons, the ultimate outcome is the most important thing, both for appellants and for the local authority. But you've picked out a couple of cost decisions that it's worth looking at because it's something that we've always got to be alive to, regardless of which side you're appearing for. And I think the first decision we wanted to have a look at was one in Nottinghamshire, a case called Land at the junction of Newark Road. What was that all about?
So this was a proposal for outline planning permission for up to 300 dwellings with associated infrastructure and landscaping. And the appeal was ultimately allowed and permission was granted. And then the appellant went on to apply for costs. And in fact, they applied for full costs and the inspector granted it. And to understand the reasons why, it's important to look at the timeline of the events that occurred. So in July 2024, The planning application went to the committee with an officer recommendation for approval. However, the committee deferred its decision on the basis that it wanted further information on various technical matters, including ground contamination. Again, this was despite technical consultees having said that they were satisfied with the proposal being allowed, provided the appropriate conditions were imposed. Then an appeal was lodged, and then in October 2024, 5 putative reasons for refusal were issued by the committee. In December 2024, then the council withdrew all of its objections, citing the new NPPF 2024 and an additional survey work submitted on ground contamination as the reasons. There were 4 reasons why the inspector awarded a full costs award against the council. Firstly, the inspector found that the minutes from the July 2024 committee were, and I quote, perfunctory, and they lacked in information, which the inspector said did not make clear why the committee asked for further information on technical matters and what further information was sought at the meeting. This was further compounded by the fact that there were no committee minutes at all from the October 2024 meeting, since it was held in private, which left the inspector clueless as to how the tilted balance was applied. Secondly, the inspector concluded that the committee had a poor understanding of the term unacceptable risk and explicitly warned against shifting the threshold of unacceptable risk to zero risk where environmental and/or public health matters were concerned. Importantly, the inspector noted that local concern and anxiety are simply not good enough reasons to deviate from the advice of technical consultees, and where technical consultees have raised no objections, then very substantial weight should be given to this. So a stark reminder to councils about the crucial role that technical consultees play and the weight that should be given. It is important to note that the inspector accepted that members are entitled to defer a decision and request further information on matters. However, there must be cogent reasons to do so. Thirdly, the decision to withdraw all 5 reasons for refusal on the basis of the new NPPF and survey works, and that too on the day proofs were due to be exchanged, was found to be unreasonable behaviour by the council. This was because the survey works only related to ground contamination, and that was only one of the reasons for refusal. And the council had accepted, even prior to the release of the new NPPF, that they did not have a 5-year housing land supply. Therefore, to what extent the new NPPF had shifted the balance was unclear. This was especially so given that there were no clear committee minutes on the matter from October 2024. The late withdrawal also meant that a significant portion of the costs had already been incurred by the appellant, and for all those reasons, a full costs award was ordered.
Thank you. NPPF point is a particularly interesting one, isn't it? Because we've seen, I'm sure all listeners will have seen, new positions, shifting positions taken by councils on appeal as a result of the new framework. And of course, that's perfectly legitimate because it's a significant policy shift. And it's only right and proper that all parties to appeals should take regard for that. But if you are considering whether or not to withdraw your case entirely on the basis of the new framework, it's important to think very carefully about the extent to which the framework actually makes a difference. Nobody doubts that it's a significant policy shift, but whether it's a significant policy shift on the facts of your particular case is going to be relevant. What other key takeaways are we looking at from this appeal then?
So first, for councils, do keep a clear note of committee minutes, because without this, the inspector is left in the dark when assessing whether allegations of unreasonable behaviour were accurate. Indeed, this is a problem for any member of the public and not just the inspector. Second, where the technical consultees have not raised objections to the proposal, provided appropriate conditions are imposed, then this should be given significant weight. And if you are seeking additional information, that is entirely within a committee's prerogative, but there must be cogent reasons to do so. Third, and this should go without saying, do not wait until the day proofs are due to be exchanged to withdraw your objections to the appeal.
Thank you. And if we're thinking about withdrawing reasons for refusal or withdrawing a case altogether, as you've rightly pointed out, and as that appeal is a good example of, that's often something that can resound in costs. However, one of the reasons that it's very important nonetheless to keep a very close eye on your case and the extent to which it's still defensible in line potentially of policy changes or updated evidence is that in fact it can be an example, quite importantly, of very reasonable behaviour to, if circumstances change or if policy changes, reconsider your case and proceed with the appeal either on remaining grounds or not altogether, in an effort to make sure that the inquiry proceeds fairly and sensibly and justly. And I think you want to take us to an appeal that makes that point very strongly, which is in Staffordshire, a case called Land North of Mucklestone.
Yes, so this was a proposal, again for outline planning permission, but this time for 150 dwellings. and the appeal was allowed. And for context, the council had originally given 4 reasons for refusal, but the first reason was withdrawn before the inquiry, and the inquiry continued on the rest. And following the last day of the inquiry, the NPPF 2024 was released, and the council then withdrew all objections since it accepted that it no longer could demonstrate a 5-year housing land supply, which shifted the balance. The appellant applied for costs on 4 grounds, but the inspector refused to order costs against the council, and the main reasons for this were threefold. Firstly, the inspector concluded that it was reasonable for the council to withdraw the first reason for refusal before the inquiry in an effort to reduce inquiry time and ensure an efficient process. Secondly, although there was a failure on the council's part to follow established case law on heritage, no unnecessary expense was incurred as a result, since this error only arose during the oral evidence at the inquiry and it did not affect the council's decision to refuse permission. Thirdly, the appellant tried to argue that the council did not decide cases in a consistent manner since the site was allocated for development in the emerging local plan. However, the inspector concluded that an allocation in the emerging local plan is not comparable to another planning application or appeal decision, since the degree of technical evidence submitted as part of a planning application is greater than that submitted for an emerging local plan. Therefore, even though the PPG states that not determining similar cases in a consistent manner could be an example of unreasonable behaviour, an emerging local plan is not a similar case comparable to another planning application or appeal decision.
Thank you. That's a really interesting decision with what could be some quite wide-ranging points made by the inspector there. What are the key takeaways?
So firstly, councils should not be afraid to drop a reason for refusal for fear of costs. Now, this can be contrasted with the Newark Road appeal, which we looked at earlier, since there all 5 reasons for refusal were dropped, and there was no clear reasoning as to why that was the case, given that the council had already accepted it did not have a 5-year housing land supply even before the release of the new NPPF. However, in this case, only one of the reasons for refusal was dropped prior to the inquiry, and the 5-year housing land supply was actively in dispute between the parties during the inquiry, and it only stopped being an issue after the release of the NPPF. This was unlike the case in the Newark Road appeal. Secondly, the ultimate question for the inspector when making a cost decision is whether unnecessary expenses have been incurred as a result of unreasonable behaviour. So, even if there has been unreasonable behaviour, but no wasted expenses have been incurred as a result of that behaviour, then costs are unlikely to be awarded. And thirdly, allocation of sites in an emerging local plan is different to a planning application or appeal, and just because a site was allocated in the emerging local plan for development, it does not mean that the council will be acting unreasonably were it to object to a planning application on the same site.
And that last point is really interesting, isn't it? Because on the face of it, if you've allocated a site in your emerging local plan, but you're refusing an application for substantially the same development at appeal shortly beforehand, that might be thought to be a very obvious example of inconsistent decision-making. But the inspector here considered that it wasn't. And I think that must be, it's going to be a very fact-specific exercise, isn't it? That must be here critical. The issue was that it was a technical issue. It was an issue requiring technical evidence. And in those circumstances, the difference in evidence base between local plan stage and a planning appeal may well be more relevant. But we've got to be careful, don't we, not to take that too widely, because if the issue is something that's going to be considered much more carefully at plan making stage, greenbelt impact, for example, it's going to be much harder, I think, probably to resist a costs application on the basis that an appeal is different. But consistency in decision making, an interesting topic. Chatura, thank you very much indeed. That's been really helpful.
Thanks, Daniel.
Well, there we are, a very useful look from Chatura at some of the more interesting recent appeal decisions in the context of housing, which raise some important issues, particularly in relation to costs, which doesn't necessarily always get the airtime that it deserves. And for those of you who want to read more into those appeal decisions that we've talked about, or simply to have a look at them and have them to hand in case similar points come to light in any of your appeals, you should find whatever you need on whatever podcast provider you listen to us on, because we've linked a set of notes with the links and the references to all of the appeal decisions in question, so you should be able to find them very nice and easily. Thank you very much indeed.